And so what I like to do is I'd like to define the concept that I'm using before we start, just to let you know how I'm defining the concept of racial microaggression. Okay? And so I say that racial microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism used to keep those with the racial margins in their place. That's how I start the definition. So it's one form of everyday racism. And again, used to keep those with the racial margins in their place. So I have three components of this definition I'd like to share with you. The first one is that there are verbal and nonverbal assaults directed towards people of color. So often we hear about the verbal assaults directed towards people of color. But Chet also talked about nonverbal assaults directed towards people of color. And the example he used in his work was on his drive to the Harvard Medical School. He would go around this glorieta, this circle, traffic circle in Boston. And in this circle was a statue of Abraham Lincoln, right? But kneeled before him was an African slave in a diaper. And what Chet, he writes about, he said, I had to see this every time I went to the medical school, if I went that way. And that was the easiest way for me to go to medical school. And so that was what we might call a visual microaggression, because he was seeing it every day, right? This example. But there are other examples. I mean, I think some people would argue, and I probably would agree, that the Confederate statues, for many people, are a form of everyday racism that's exemplified in these statues that we see, or the Confederate flag that we often see in various spaces. So again, there are verbal and nonverbal assaults. And again, one thing I want to share with you here is that my work focuses on people of color. I'm looking at the target, the person on the receiving end of the microaggression, right? As you'll see in a second, my work doesn't focus on the perpetrator. Other people do that work that we'll talk about through this presentation. The second part of this, my definition, is that they're layered assaults. Often we think of them as just racial assaults, but they're really intersectional assaults. Sometimes they're about race and gender. African American women experiencing specific types of everyday racism. Latinas experiencing specific types of everyday racism. A Latina transgender experiences a particular type of everyday racism. So again, they're layered, which can also include, as I say here, one's language, one's immigration status, one's phenotype, one's accent, one's surname. So again, it's just not only about race, but it's how race intersects with other forms of marginalization and subordination. These everyday races, it's just one-off, just one example, and they'll try to dismiss that example. But when you do this work and when you interview people, when you talk to people, they talk about the cumulative nature of everyday racism and its impact on one's physical and mental health. So those are the three areas that I want to sort of focus on as we go through this presentation. They're verbal and nonverbal assaults, they're layered assaults, and they're cumulative assaults. So here's one of the models. I'm going to share with you at least two models that I use to study everyday racism. And so the first model, and again, this is from, I've been collecting data now for about, since 1993, 94. So about 25 years I've been collecting data in various forms. My students are collecting data, my graduate students and my undergraduate students are also collecting data in various forms around racial microaggressions. And so we place racial microaggressions at the center of this model, but it takes place within the context of institutional racism. Right? So these everyday forms of racism take place within that context. And we have a perpetrator on one end, and we have a primary target on the other. Someone who's directly experiencing this everyday form of racism. We'll call her Elma for a second, for the purpose of this presentation. But have you ever been in a situation where you're a secondary target? The microaggression, the assault isn't directed towards you. It's probably directed towards Alma, but you're experiencing it. You hear it, right? You feel it. There's very little research in that area on secondary microaggressions, or secondary targets of microaggression. And every time I give a talk like this, I'm hoping that someone will pick up this idea and maybe move it forward in their own doctoral research or their own research agenda. We'll call her for a second Mary, okay? And we'll call the perpetrator Allison. So here's what happens. Allison says something to Alma. She said, and this is right from the data that I've collected. She told Alma, Alma, you're different from those other Mexicans. Thank you. Right. So Alma says, did she just say that? Right. You're in that situation where someone says something, you ask yourself, I just hear what I think I heard. Right. So Alma's saying that. But Alma responds, she says, then how do you think of me? She pushes back against Allison. Or she'll say, how else do you think of Mexicans, Allison? Right? Or she'll say, or then Allison backtracks, realizing she may have made a mistake, may have crossed a line. She says, I think you misinterpreted what I meant. So she's backtracking, right? Or she'll say something like this. She'll say, but I meant it as a compliment. Or she'll say something like, you're being too sensitive. Or she'll say something like, it was just a joke. Get a sense of humor, Alma. Or she'll say, don't act like a victim. Or she'll say, you're taking this too serious. So this is some of the responses that Allison might give to this really, this everyday form of racism in this one comment. You're not like all the rest of them, all the rest of those Mexicans. And this happens, unfortunately, too often. And so my work doesn't focus on the intent of the perpetrator. I don't look at Allison's work. I don't study Allison's work. Other people do. I mentioned earlier with the meeting earlier that Daryl Sue's work focuses on Allison's, along with Elma. But his work focuses on that dyad, that counselor-client dyad. My work focuses on the impact of the microaggression on Elma or other people on the receiving end of that racial microaggression. That's the work that I do. It's not that I don't think this is important. It's just that it's not the work I do, right? And other people do this work. And as I said earlier today, I may take it back, what I just said in the Q&A, if someone asks a particular type of question about the perpetrator. So here's a pause point. And although if we had more time, I would stop here and we'd have a conversation about how you might respond. And maybe we will. Anyone here want to, if you're Alma, how would you respond to Allison's comment? Or that racial microaggressive assault comment that she made about Alma? Anyone? Yes?
I like asking questions.
Okay.
I'll say like, what do you mean by that?
Okay.
And then they'll say an answer, and then follow up with another question.
Okay.
And you really get to think about like their thought processes, and I think they also like reflect on, oh, I really said that.
Okay. Just using the Socratic method. Okay. Any else? Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, that hand going up, but I guess not. Anyone else want to?
I'll go.
Yeah.
That's racist.
Okay. Just call it out.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's continue on. I mean, because that comment came out in the Washington Post in January of 2018. Calling out racists is actually good for your health, according to science, and here's how to do it. So this is an article. If you check it out, you read it, you'll see some links. If you press on the links, you'll see some research now that's out there. It's actually been out there for a while, but it's research that basically says responding the way you responded, calling it out is actually good for one's health. Challenging a comment like that is actually good for one's health. And it's good in this way. And I actually would recommend you read the article that the research is based on. It's a really powerful piece of research. Because one of the things it does, they found, is that it expanded as opposed to constricted your arteries. And we know that constricted arteries have negative health outcomes. Expanded arteries don't have as negative health outcomes. So in this particular research they talk about, it expands as opposed to constrict your arteries. It also says it builds your self-confidence. It also says that it builds your self-esteem, and it also says that there are feelings of empowerment as a result of pushing back, in answering either the way you answered or the way you answered. So what it argues in essence is that pushing back is good for your health. However, we know that doesn't always happen. People often in situations like that don't respond. They don't want to respond in that context. Maybe they're dealing with power relations and they don't want to put themselves in a position where they might be vulnerable, right? Or they just, sometimes we freeze. We just freeze. We don't know how to respond. We don't At the moment, we don't know how to respond. We may walk away and then go home and say, I wish I would have said this. If only I had said this. So you take that home with you, that non-response. And sometimes when we do respond, we question ourselves as well. I mean, should I have said it that way? Should I have been so assertive in my response? I mean, so sometimes you can't win in how you respond in many contexts. So here's a second model we use. It's a model for understanding racial microaggressions, where we talk about the types of racial microaggressions. I'll give you examples in a second. The context in which they occur, the effects of the racial microaggression on the person on the receiving end of the racial microaggression, and then finally, how one would respond to these everyday forms of racism or racial microaggression. And so, just to give you a little context here, though, because right now you're seeing, you're hearing, and I'll give examples of different institutions where the response to some of these everyday forms of racism on our campuses, or in our streets with police departments, or with our healthcare providers in hospitals or other spaces, is to engage them in implicit bias training. This is important research. There may be people in this university who do some really important work. I know at our university, some of the best work I think is being done by Jerry Kong in our law school. There's some really important work on implicit bias. I don't do implicit bias research because I argue that implicit bias, I think it's important, but as I said earlier, I don't really do work on the intent of the perpetrator. I deal with the targeting of the racial microaggression. And I would argue that when you focus on the intent of the perpetrator, it's an intent-centered model, right? My work is on the target of the microaggression, the elmas of the war, the people on the receiving end of the racial microaggression. It's an effects and response-centered model. I care about the impact that it has on Elma and how she responds. That's the work that I do. So I'm going to give you an example here. Watching others as he tense up as he passes. And the bold and underline are my coding. I'm coding for racial microaggressions here. No matter the neighborhood where he grew up. Race matters to the young woman's sense of self when she states her hometown and then is pressed, know where you really from, regardless of how many generations her family has been in this country. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce the most crippling of thoughts. I do not belong here. Anyone want to guess or know who made this comment? Who wrote this, who gave this talk, or this speech, or parts of the speech? Anyone? One guess? Barack Obama. No. Justice Sotomayor. Sonia Sotomayor made these comments in a dissenting opinion, right? You can read this dissenting opinion in a U.S. Supreme Court case called Should Be Banned in 2014. If you read that 51-page dissent, her and Justice Ginsburg wrote the dissent. She was the primary author on this dissent. But if you read that dissent, it's about 51 pages. It's an amazing sort of story about how racism manifests itself. She never used the word racial microaggressions. That's the word that I used. That's the coding I'm using. But she's talking about everyday forms of racism. And I think that you rarely see legal opinions, in this case Supreme Court opinions, where they talk about racism in this way. Now, having said that, if you've read Justice Thurgood Marshall's dissents in Rodriguez versus San Antonio, in Bakke versus UC Regents, his dissents are really powerful dissents, but they don't talk about everyday racism. What Justice Marshall talked about is institutional racism, the history of racism in his dissents. And I really recommend that you read some of these dissenting opinions by Justice Sotomayor, by Justice Marshall, because they really, really are powerful ways to talk about the history of racism and how everyday racism manifests itself, in this case, in the Stewart v. Van case. This particular case was an affirmative action case. It was Proposal 2 in the state of Michigan, and it was challenged all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was similar to our Prop 209 here in California, that the court basically upheld their 209, which is called Prop 2 there in the state of Michigan. It's a really important decision if you're thinking about the future, how the court's going to deal with affirmative action in the next couple of years, especially around the two cases that are making their way through the court right now out of Harvard University and the University of North Carolina. Those cases are on the way to the Supreme Court, and you're going to begin to hear some of these arguments as the case makes its way through the lower courts. Another one. Instead, they will make assumptions about who they think you are based on their limited notion of the world. We felt the sting of those daily slights throughout our entire lives. The folks who cross the street in fear of their safety. The clerks who kept a close eye on us in all those department stores. And the people at formal events who assumed that we were the help. And those who have questioned our intelligence, our honesty, even our love of this country. Anyway. At least one? Okay, you're close. You're close. It's Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama gave her commencement address at Tuskegee University, an historically black college, in May of 2015. And she was talking to black graduates at Tuskegee. And she was telling them about what they were going to experience, what they left into that world. And again, she didn't use the word racial microaggressions. I was coding for racial microaggressions, but she was giving me examples in her speech. So I look for examples like this in Supreme Court opinions or dissenting opinions, in speeches, in various places. I'm looking for data that help me explain this everyday form of racism we call racial microaggressions. And so more types and context. The 2016 presidential campaign of Donald Trump. In fact, I think Nicholas Kristof is here tonight. If you read, he has at least 6 or 7 pieces that he's written on white privilege. Really good pieces that he's written. I mean, he's gotten a lot of trouble talking about white privilege as a white reporter or a white person, but they're really powerful ways in which he talks about white privilege, how he experiences white privilege in various contexts. There's about 6 of them out right now in the New York Times. If you Google them, you can find them. In this particular one, he's not talking about white privilege. He's talking about, is Donald Trump making America meaner? And so here's the context. He said, and he's writing this, he says, but in the middle of a physics class, picture yourself in a physics class in high school. So we're sitting in that physics class. And suddenly, this spring, a group of white students suddenly began jeering at their Latino classmates and chanting, build the wall, build the wall. Picture yourself in that context. Picture yourself as a young Latina or Latino student in that physics class, experiencing your colleagues, the other students in that class, start chanting, build the wall. This is what these students did, though, in Forest Grove, Oregon, at Forest Grove High School. They walked out. And that was their response. They basically walked out, went to the principal's office, didn't get what they were looking for, or a response that they were looking for. So they went to the superintendent. They actually pushed back against that racist chant in their physics classroom. I'm concerned about the impact on them, but I'm also concerned about the response. I'm really interested in the response, how they responded. If you have done any research in this area, I picked this one in Forest Grove, Oregon, but you can find examples like this all through the United States, during the election and up until right now. You could probably find one right now if you Google something about these build the wall chants that we're hearing or seeing on high school campuses, college campuses, in other spaces, right? But again, this is one response that people have. Other responses all across the country, people are doing different things. In LAUSD, 3 or 4 days after the election, 18 schools walked out in LAUSD and walked to the LA school board and basically picketed in front of the LA school board, right? Then they walked over to the LA City Hall and picketed there, walked there and basically had a rally there. I mean, students are very upset about what's happening across the country, not just in Los Angeles, not just in Forest Grove, Oregon, but we're finding these examples all through the United States. And I'll give you a resource in a second. UC Merced. last month, in March, right? I didn't know about this. I had no clue this was happening. What it was that there was a tabling there at UC Merced, one of our sister campuses, where the young Republicans basically were giving people, they were telling people, if you know of an undocumented, an illegal alien, they said, call ICE, and they gave you the ICE number, right? That was the tabling that was taking place. The reason I found out about this was that the custodian on my floor in Moore Hall at UCLA, her daughter goes there, and she told me, Danny, have you heard about this, right? And I go, no, I hadn't heard about it. So we went into my office, and we Googled it, right? And we found the examples, not just in the campus newspaper, but in the local Merced newspaper, examples of how the university didn't deal with it, unfortunately. The chancellor didn't deal with this. Again, calling it free speech, right? I mean, not dealing with the question of what's different between free speech and hate speech. And I think that's a question I think we have to continue to ask about some of these incidents. But this is one in our own sister campus. Right up the road in San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly, about a week ago, or less than a week ago, this happened, where these racist flyers spurred what they call this campus outrage. They basically went into faculty office or the boards outside their offices and defaced different sort of, in this case, a poster saying that this particular person, Neil McDougall, he's an unafraid educator. He supports undocumented students and their families. And someone went and crossed out or tried to rip up the poster. This happened to a number of faculty, number of people on that campus. There were also racial slurs in the bathroom that were written on the bathroom stalls. This also happened. This Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. They basically dressed up as using these gangster stereotypes. Among other things, they did this. They had a blackface party, or someone dressed up in blackface. This is 2018. This is at a campus right up the road from us. But this is an example of what's happening in this world. And I would argue that although Trump has a lot to do with this, or some to do with this, we've been seeing these things now for generations. This is not really new. I think maybe the intensity of it is new, and the amount of it is new, but it's been around for quite a while. We have folks who are doing some of this research on hate for a couple of decades now. This is the most recent manifestations of that. But the president of Cal Poly, this is what he said. And if you go to his website, the Facebook page, he has an extensive letter of how he's responding. And he's being criticized for his response, but this is what he said. He said, I am announcing today that indefinite suspension of all Panhellenic and Interfraternity Council fraternities and sororities at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. I mean, he basically said it's over, at least for now, for the sorority and fraternity system there, right? Other campuses have just focused on either a member of that fraternity or sorority, or only that fraternity and sorority. But he basically took the position that sororities and fraternities, until they do an evaluation of who they are and what they're doing, he suspended all of them on that campus. That's really a bold move when you think about it in this time, because if you read his blog page or the page, he's getting a lot of hate sort of responses to having done this. He also went on to say, his name is Jeffrey Armstrong, he said, I especially want to emphasize that it is not the burden of groups who are at the targets of hurtful actions to solve this problem, right? To keep this, to keep it in the public eye. It's not their responsibility. He says these are the very members of our family who had to endure the systemic inequalities throughout their lives. He's saying that we have to do something, right? Don't rely on people of color to do it for you. You have to do something. And it's a really bold sort of assertion that he made in that particular letter to his community, letter to the San Luis Obispo community, Cal Poly community. This just happened, I think, about a little over 2 weeks ago, as one response. University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you read this report to the chancellor of the Ku Klux Klan, the history of the Ku Klux Klan at the University of Wisconsin, it's a powerful 31-page history of the Klan, how they came to that university, how they're a part of that university. But it's telling the story, the history of institutional racism at the University of Wisconsin. Often universities don't want to talk about that history. They don't want that history out. But I applaud the University of Wisconsin for basically putting out this history. I think other universities should do that. I wish my university would do that. UCLA would talk about its history, about its racist history, right? I don't think that's going to happen. I wish it would, and maybe I should be pushing that, or maybe others should be pushing that. But my feeling is that it's not going to happen at UCLA, at least at the moment. But it did happen in Wisconsin. There's a model out there of how universities could begin to tell that history. Again, a resource. The Southern Poverty Law Center, if you go to the website right now, you can download this report. It's called The Trump Effect. It's subtitled The Impact of the Presidential Campaign on Our Nation's Schools. And what it is, it's teachers who have written in about their experiences during the campaign and post-campaign, about how they experienced these anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, sexist, and racist sort of examples in their classroom and in their communities. So I recommend you download that report. It's a really powerful report. It's a report of teachers who are telling their experiences with these everyday forms of racism in their schools. So I say the Trump effect continues. I mean, if we just, I guess, Google tonight, after this presentation, you're going to find something. You're going to find something that's happening out there right now that deals with the question around immigration, at least immigration, the build the wall, something about, I know, is it tomorrow that the case is going before the Supreme Court, the oral argument before the Supreme Court around Hawaii, around the anti-Muslim sort of ban? So you're going to hear tweets probably tomorrow, or you're going to hear people's commenting about tomorrow about these very issues. So it doesn't end. It hasn't ended. And I think it's really important that we keep our attention on what's happening, especially in this case that's going before the Supreme Court tomorrow. So what I would argue that what I've shared with you so far is that the micro and microaggression doesn't mean less than. And I talked about this in an earlier presentation or an earlier discussion, because people criticize the people who use racial microaggressions. Is that, that sounds macro to me. And that's a legitimate sort of response. But again, if you've read the work of Chet Pierce, the person who introduced us to this terminology, he would argue that the microaggression doesn't mean less than. I agree with him. The micro and microaggression means in the everyday. It's these everyday forms of racism that people experience. And so, some of the effects of racism in the everyday, from some of the work that we've been doing over the years, is that you get angry, or I'm sorry, they're painful, they hurt. Being exposed to these everyday forms of racism can be really hurtful if you're on the receiving end. You get angry, you get stressed, or what my colleague at the University of Utah, William Smith, calls racial battle fatigue sets in. Right? You doubt yourself. Imposter syndrome may set in. Right? When do they get find out I don't belong here? You hear this often from folks, right? This imposter syndrome as an effect of everyday racism. It affects people's academic performance. Here, I'm not going to go into any detail at all, but here's where I think the work of Claude Steele, stereotype threat, might be at play here as well, right? In terms of its effect on academic performance. And then finally, poor health outcomes. It affects your health, your physiological health, your well-being. And so, race-related stress has negative health outcomes. We know that from the research. And if you tonight, after this presentation, if you just Google David Williams' TED Med Talk, David Williams, professor at Harvard University in the School of Public Health and in the Department of Sociology, he has this TED Talk called How Racism Makes Us Sick. It's a powerful sort of 17-minute example, giving us examples of someone who's done some really important work on everyday racism. He's come up with one of the most powerful, most productive scales of how we measure everyday racism, right? And so I would recommend you take a look at that talk. Responses to racial microaggressions. Deny them. We deny they exist, some people. So that wasn't racism. I mean, Elma could have said, wow, that wasn't racism. She could have backed off, right? She could have just, in that thought bubble, she could have said, no, that's not what it is, and then moved on. Not said anything to Ellison. Or you can police yourself. You don't go to certain places. We're finding out more and more when we study racial microaggression on college campuses that people of color tell us we don't go to certain parts of campus. There are certain parts of campus we don't go to, right? Have you ever been in a situation where there's certain stores you won't go to, certain restaurants you won't go to, certain spaces you don't want to be in because you've experienced some negative sort of racial microaggression at some time earlier? Again, we police ourselves as a response. We prove them wrong. We want to prove them wrong. I'm going to prove that stereotype you have of black people or Latinos or women wrong, even if it kills them, to prove it wrong. And basically, you're going to prove that stereotype wrong. We often see that in our research. It's really prevalent. Students will tell us, I'm going to prove the professor wrong. I'm going to prove my colleagues wrong. We resist. Another one. We fight back. We push back. Those students in Forest Grove, Oregon was an example of resistance in that particular context. But there are examples all over of students resisting everyday forms of racism and communities resisting everyday forms of racism. We create counter spaces, academic and social counter spaces. I was talking to the director earlier. That center right next door is an example of a counter space. It's an example where people, if you just read their flyer, it's a place where they welcome people to come into that space, right? Who experience discrimination outside of that space. Come here, and we recognize you, we welcome you in the space. But there are other examples of counter spaces. Tomorrow at 12 noon, if you're at UCLA, Wednesday at 12 noon, I'm sorry. If you're at UCLA with me, and we walk down to the Bruin right there in the middle of campus at Big Bear, between 12 and 2 at UCLA, it's called Black Wednesday. And that's where African American students go to, from 12 to 2 on Wednesday. Right? Other black people will be there. It's a space where they come together. It's a space where they socialize. I don't think it's an academic space. It's probably more of a social space. But it's a space where they know other black people at UCLA will come together during that time, between 12 and 2 on Wednesday, Black Wednesday. I'm not sure if UCSB has a similar sort of space or time, but we find these at other institutions as well, where black students or Latino students go to certain spaces, right, to often heal, or to see other black people, or to see other Latinos, or to see other Native Americans or Asian American students, right? Again, we create these counter spaces. Various art forms. I mean, I just finished, I was telling Jeff and my brother Ronnie earlier, that I just finished an 8-part series called Soundbreakers, right? It's about music, and it's a really powerful sort of history of music. I'm looking more and more now at humor as a response to everyday racism. I listen to like Dave Chappelle's work, Chris Rock's work, not all of it, some of it. Some of it, some of it's really funny, but some of it just has, the message is a little off in some ways, at least from my perspective, as a researcher, studying it. But there are things that they say in some of these skits that are really spot on when it talks about how people respond to everyday racism, right? So I think these various art forms, this last, it just ended. There was a couple of exhibits up here, the Pacific Standard Time exhibits that were from August of last year till February of this year. These Latino art exhibits that were all through the southern part of the state of California. I know there were some here in Santa Barbara, but art, if you look at public art as a response to everyday racism, was a good example of some of these. There's an exhibit still on as part of Pacific Standard Time at the Autry Museum in Southern California called La Raza, which is a photo exhibit of the Chicana movement of the late 1960s or 1970s. It's just photographs, powerful photographs. But again, as a journalistic, or I would call it an art form of how communities respond to everyday racism and sexism. And then finally, micro-affirmations as a response, and that's what I want to talk to you about in a second, a little more in the work that I'm doing. Another TED Talk that I just found, one of my students sent to me about a week ago, is Howard Stevenson at UPenn did this talk on how to resolve racially stressful situations. It's a powerful, again, 15, 16, 17-minute talk where he's talking about racial literacy, right? And racial literacy, part of racial literacy is what we're talking about right now, the concept of racial microaggressions. That's a part of racial literacy. And racial socialization, how do we socialize our families to these everyday forms of racism. And in this particular talk, it's a powerful talk where he's talking about his son and how he's talking to his son about the experiences of racism in the everyday. But teaching him about growing up as an African-American young man in the context of Philadelphia. However, going to privileged schools, but still, when you walk maybe away from that space, and I would argue even while you're in that space, when you walk away from that space, as happened at the Starbucks in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago, I mean, your race goes with you, race follows you in this particular context. But it's a powerful discussion, and it's a very emotional discussion of how he's talking to his son, how he's socializing his son, of how to live black in Philadelphia. It's really powerful. Another book that I would recommend is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Any of you have read that? It's really a beautiful letter to his son. It's a powerful letter to his son, talking about race and racism. Right? So those, I think, are some examples of how we socialize our children and our families to dealing with racially stressful situations. And so I would argue that micro-affirmations are a response to everyday racism. And here's where it began. It began for me, it probably started before this, but this was the trigger, right? In 2015, at the Harvard Law School, this is the front page of the Washington Post. Harvard Law has a serious racism problem, Dean says, after black professors' portraits were defaced. Anybody remember this incident? This is a show of hands? Okay. So people remember this, right? And so this is what happened. This is what happened in that November of 2015. Overnight, it happened between when the law school closed down, shut down, well, at least the offices closed down, and then opened up the next morning. This is what Harvard, a lot of law schools have this. We don't have this in our school of education. I don't think you have it in your school of education either. We have portraits of all the faculty in the hallways. Law schools do this. Anyway, what happened is that if you can see the upper left-hand corner, someone went through and black-faced, or black-taped, I'm sorry, all of the African-American professors' portraits. So, Professor Tamiko Brown-Nagin, her portrait was taped, black-taped. Professor Randall Kennedy, black-taped. Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, black-taped. Professor Kenneth Mack, black-taped. Professor Brian Price, black-taped. Professor Ronald Sullivan, black-taped. And so what happened, is that the paper started interviewing students. And this is what one of the Harvard Law School, I think she was a second-year law student, said. She said, for a lot of students, particularly students of color, it's not surprising what took place with the black taping. It's just one public, it's more public, it's just more public. It's a public manifestation of what we experience in the classroom every day. Derecka Purnell at Harvard Law School. But here's what happened. Students, somebody went in and started putting Post-it notes around the portraits. Right? And they started putting notes to the faculty. Really, in essence, telling them how important they were. How important they were to be there at Harvard Law School. And so this is what Professor Ronald Sullivan, what he put out in the newspaper the next day. He said, my shock and dismay, however, were replaced with joy and admiration when I saw the lovely notes of affirmation and appreciation that Harvard Law students placed on our portraits. Right? So he's giving me a term that helps me explain what's happening with those notes. And, but here's what I recalled. when I first seen that article in 2015, I remembered a letter that I had read in a book by Henry Louis Gates, professor of African American Studies at Harvard University. And this is the book. It's called Colored People. I had read this book back in the mid-90s, 1994. It's his memoir. It's called Colored People. As I said earlier, he's only, at the time, about 40 years old, so he's doing a memoir at 40. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. But it's a powerful memoir. It really is. I really recommend it. I think those kind of stories are really needed, of how people of color make their way through various spaces, but in this case, academic spaces. But if you read this, what I remember, this I remember, how many years later, almost 20-some odd years later, I remembered a letter that starts the book. That's what I remembered. I remember this letter. It was a letter to his daughters, Maggie and Liza. And so, and I'll put the letter in context. The letter goes like this, or the context goes like this. His daughters were embarrassed of him. His daughters were embarrassed of him because he had, in a public setting, acknowledged a perfect stranger. And they got embarrassed. And they told their father they got embarrassed. So I guess this is what academics do, right? Rather than sort of talk to your kids right there, we write letters. And he wrote this beautiful letter that starts the book, Colored People. It's a powerful letter. I'm going to give you a couple of excerpts from the letter. This is what he said. He said, "Dear Maggie and Liza," he said, "last summer I sat at a sidewalk cafe in Italy, and 3 or 4 black Italians walked casually by. Each spoke to me, rather each nodded his head slightly or acknowledged me with a glance ever so subtly. When growing up, we always did this with each other, passing boats in a sea of white folk, which is why I still nod or speak to black people on the streets, and why it felt so good to be acknowledged by the Afro-Italians who passed my table at that cafe in Milan. Above all, I enjoy the unself-conscious moments of a shared cultural intimacy, whatever form they take, when no one else is watching, when no white people are around, and I hope you'll understand why I continue to speak to colored people I pass on the streets. Love, Daddy." Really powerful letter, but it reminded me of that self-affirmation, that affirmation that those students had given to those law professors in 2015, in November of 2015. And so here's how I'm defining it, and part of this definition comes from work that I mentioned earlier. The work of Mary Rowe at MIT, she's written about affirmations, but they're more gendered affirmations. There's no racial dimension to her work, and there's no theoretical foundation to her work, which I thought is really important, but I think as a researcher, I needed to sort of lay down some theoretical foundations, and that's why I use critical race theory and racial microaggressions as a way to do that. So I'm defining them as often small and or brief interactions, or to use Skip Gates, moments of a shared cultural intimacy that make people acknowledged and valued. That's how I'm defining racial micro-affirmations. And this work actually is work that we're doing right now. My co-researcher is Lindsay Perez-Hoover at Cal State Long Beach, and her daughter, Layla Verhan-Hoover, who's, we started doing some of this work in, about 2 or 3 years ago. And I may share the story with you a little bit later, how she became involved in our research as a 9 or 10-year-old. So other examples of microaffirmation. So I took this idea back to my own campus, on my own campus, and I shared it with our TEP program, our teacher education program. And I asked them, similar to what I'm going to ask you later, give me some examples. Am I on the right track? Are we on the right track in talking about these everyday affirmations that we express to each other as a response to everyday racism? So a teacher basically got involved in the conversation. She said this. She said, a Latina teacher, she said, "My mother giving me a bendición or a blessing when I leave the house or when she dropped me off at school." That's how she interpreted a microaffirmation. Right? And she says, "I still get my bendición, I still get my blessing as an adult. And when I don't get my blessing, I think something's wrong." In terms of my mother's, maybe she's mad at me. So she went on and talked about how that term, microaffirmation, how it impacted her. I went to our Principals Leadership Institute, this institute where we train principals for public schools, mostly public schools. And an African American in the class, she went into her purse and pulled out a fictitious brush or comb, and she started combing someone's hair, right? And she said, my morning ritual of combing my daughter's hair and telling her how beautiful she is, because I know that's not how the world sees her. So we engage in these rituals, either with our parents or with our children. And there's other examples of how this manifests itself. This is another example of a microaffirmation. This is Jacob, Philadelphia. And he asked President Obama, he said, I want to know if my hair is just like yours. Right? And President Obama bowed his head and let him touch his hair. So my question is, how do we affirm Derecka Purnell, that student who said, this happens in the everyday, it happens all the time in our classes there at Harvard Law. And other students in other places, like UCLA, like Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, like UCSB, like UC Merced, like East Los Angeles College, other spaces where people are experiencing this in the everyday. I'm asking a couple of questions here. So, is the presence of people of color, in a space like UCSB, or a classroom at UCSB, a major at UCSB or UCLA or any place else, is the presence of people of color in text, in what we read, right, in our curriculum, in our history? Is the presence of people of color in history, is that a microaffirmation? Right? That's what we're looking at right now. I mean, how does this manifest itself? The story I gave earlier was that Lindsay's daughter, we were working at Whittier College, right? We were working on some ideas about microaffirmations. And her daughter is sitting there with us, but she has these earphones on. We thought she was watching a movie, but she's not watching them, she's listening to us, right? And so we're talking about different ways in which microaffirmations can be manifested. And so what Lindsay did is that, or what Layla did, her daughter, she said, she pulled off her headphones and said, she asked her mom, can I say something? Yeah. So she goes, well, how about Esperanza Rising? That children's book that she was reading. I mean, is that a microaffirmation? Because I like what I see myself in that book, right? And so we brought her into the team, right? She's now part of the team. In fact, we have an article coming out in, I think it's going to be the Florida Law Review, hopefully soon, I mean maybe in the next couple of weeks, where there's 3 authors, myself, Lindsay, and Layla Berhan Uber. She's our 3rd author, because she basically helped us put this together, helped us think about this. We have a project right now that's Lindsay's heading, that's looking at, initially we're looking at children's books as a form of racial microaffirmation. And we've collected about 250 to 300 children's books, and we're analyzing them right now for different ways in which people are affirmed either in the narrative or in pictures, because that's often what you see a lot in children's books. But we're looking at examples of microaffirmations in that type of text. Our next project, after that, we're going to do the same thing for African American, Native American children's books, and do the same analysis to see how people are affirmed, or young people might be affirmed in those texts, right? Or not. Because we think we're going to find some pretty negative racial microaggressions in some of these, because we've seen them. And in fact, Layla brought it to our attention. Again, we don't read those books, she's reading those books. One of them was called Don't Tell Lies, Lucy. I don't know if you know that book. I know it now. But basically, it's an example of a microaggression that she experienced when reading that book. A stereotype of one of the characters basically talking about a Mexican bandit who stole the bike, right? Again, using the stereotype of a Mexican bandit who steals, this kind of thing. And she picked it up. She picked it up. So that's why she's part of our team. So she's really, really perceptive in how she reads now. One would argue, well, do you really want her to be so critical of everything she reads, everything she sees? Yeah, exactly. It's amazing. She's an amazing young scholar, activist at her school too. And so the flip side of that is the absence of people of color in a space, in text, in history, a microaggression. So we're asking these types of questions and using data, collecting data to try to answer these questions in various contexts. And so Chet Chet gave us an example of what we should do when we experience racial microaggressions. Chet said that the black, and I would add people of color, must be taught to recognize microaggressions and construct his, and I would add her, future by taking appropriate action at each instance of recognition. So he answered the question that many of you might be asking, right? What do we do? What do we do if you're a person of color? But he says the recognition piece is really important, and the action piece is really important. I would argue that I do Freudian work, right? So I'm going to add another dimension here, another piece here. I recognize recognition is really important in Freudian pedagogy, but critical reflection is also really important. In your departments, in other spaces you find yourself. What do we do when we see these microaggressive assaults taking place? So I argue the institutions need to develop an action plan. They need to, that's what often people will say, what's your plan? Tell me what your plan now is for what's happening right now at your institution. I was at USF 2 Mondays ago, and I went in proactively. They called me in to talk to the law faculty about racial microaggressions in the classroom, in other spaces at the USF Law. And about less than a week before I got there, they had an incident where someone went and defaced two of the clinic bulletin boards, one on immigration and one on global immigration. Right? They basically went in there and scrawled racist messages on their board. So now they had to deal with an incident that they didn't have to deal with when they first invited me to come. And so their answer to me was, can you talk to the students? So I had a conversation with the students about what was taking place in terms of everyday racism at that campus. And then at the last minute he said, the dean asked me, can you talk with the staff? Because we often ignore staff in these situations, and can you please talk to them as well? So I agreed to talk to them. But again, I think that he was basically reacting. He was proactive in the beginning, but he was reactive as these incidents began to take place. But in the end, what we talked about with the faculty and the students and the staff was, what is your action plan now? How are you going to move forward with this as an institution, as a school? Because this is not going away. Students are really upset. Staff is really upset. And the faculty are really upset. You have to have an action plan to move forward. And so sometimes we don't get to this point where we talk about, okay, what are you going to do now? If you go to the website and see what President Armstrong is doing over at San Luis Obispo, in part of that letter, he lays out some really details what they're doing right now. You may disagree with what he's doing, but there's some detail in how he's responding. Some people don't like what he's doing because he's shutting down all fraternities and sororities there at San Luis Obispo. But others think that there should be more to what he's doing. That's not enough. That we should find those students and kick them out of the university. That's what some students are calling for. So again, as action plans go, I think it's moving in the right direction. What's happening at San Luis Obispo. It's not over yet, and I think there's more to be done. So 6 things, and I'll end it here, that I'd like you to remember about racial microaggressions that are takeaways from this presentation. The first is that the micro and microaggression doesn't mean less than. The micro and microaggression means in the everyday. That's what it means from my perspective, the work that I do. The second is that remember the cumulative impact of verbal and nonverbal microaggressive assaults on people of color. That they can be both verbal and nonverbal assaults on people of color. The third one is microaggressions matter because they are symptoms of larger structural problems. This is what differentiates some of the work that we do from other people who work on racial microaggressions. We look at microaggressions, as I said in that early model, as part of a structure of institutional racism and white supremacy. Now, having conversations about the R word, race, that's difficult enough, right? These are hard conversations to have. You add the racism word, and it becomes even more difficult for people. You add white supremacy into the conversation, and people it's hard for the people to deal with. But I think these are terms, these are concepts that we have to engage in if we're going to talk about everyday racism in various contexts, like universities. The fourth one is that we need to educate ourselves to understand the nature of institutional race and everyday racism and the ideologies that are foundational to it. So we have to do hard work. Right? As the president said, people of color aren't going to do the work for you. You have to do the work yourself. That's what he was telling his community, right? And I think this is what we're saying here, is that we have to really educate ourselves. And there are various ways that we can talk about how that might be done. Fifth, is that we need to recognize and disrupt the discourse of racial microaggressions in the everyday. So the recognition and the disruption. And then finally, we need to affirm the dignity and humanity of one another as a response to everyday racism. That gets back to the micro-affirmation piece that I shared earlier. And so these are what racial microaggressions are from my work and my perspective. And this is why racial microaggressions matter. Again, from my perspective and from the work that I do.